The first thing anyone noticed about Hartwell Hall was the light. On winter nights, when the city pulled its coat tight and ducked its head against the wind, the hall blazed from the inside out, amber and gold spilling through its tall arched windows like something alive, like a lantern set in the chest of the street. The marble columns out front wore a thin skin of frost. The brass door handles gleamed even in the dark, and the sound, when the doors opened and shut, when some patron stepped out for a breath of cold air, the sound that leaked into the night was something close to a physical thing. It moved through the frozen air. It settled on your skin. Daniel Mercer noticed all of it. He had been noticing it for 14 months. He dragged the snow shovel along the broad front steps, the metal scraping a low rhythm against the stone, and paused to watch a couple step out of a black car at the curb. The woman wore a coat that probably cost more than his rent. The man checked his phone with the casual indifference of someone who had never once had to check his account balance before spending. They walked up the steps without looking down. Without looking at him, their shoes passed within 2 feet of his boots, which had a crack along the left sole that let in the slush, so that by the time he finished the steps, his left sock was always cold and dark with wet. He kept shoveling. He was 38 years old. He had a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so tired, not old tired, but the kind of tired that comes from carrying things for too long, from smiling at the wrong hours, from spending 5 years being both mother and father to a small girl who deserved at least one parent who slept through the night. His name was Daniel. The other members of the overnight custodial crew called him Dan. His daughter called him Daddy. No one in Hartwell Hall called him anything at all. He finished the front steps, stacked the salt along the entry rail, and pulled his cart around to the service entrance at the side of the building. The guitar case was there, strapped to the side of the cart with a bungee cord, old black canvas worn to gray at the corners, the handle duct-taped twice where the original seam had split. He had carried that guitar case for so long that the motion of reaching for it, of swinging it onto his shoulder, was as natural as breathing. He hadn't played a note in front of another human being in 4 years, but he always brought it. He couldn't say exactly why. Habit, maybe. Or something more like hope, the kind you don't examine too closely because examination might dissolve it. Inside, the hall was warming up. He could hear them through the walls of the corridor, the orchestra, in the middle of their evening rehearsal, running through a passage from the second movement. The sound came through the plaster and brick, not as music exactly, but as the idea of music, low and full, like a conversation in another room that you can feel even if you can't hear the words. Daniel stopped pushing the cart. Just for a moment. He stood very still in the service corridor, eyes closed, and let the vibration move through him. Then the door at the far end of the corridor swung open, and Marcus Webb, second violin, 26 years old, a man who had been called a prodigy in 4 separate magazine profiles, stepped out, holding a coffee cup and a phone. Looked at Daniel, looked through Daniel, and walked back inside without saying a word. Daniel opened his eyes. He picked up the mop handle. He had a corridor to clean. The custodial staff rotated through 4 zones during the overnight shift. Daniel always took the backstage corridor and the lower lobby. He was the one who'd asked for that assignment when he started. Murray, the shift supervisor, had given him a look that said, "Sure, whatever you want, it's all floors to me," and Daniel had accepted the look and kept his reasons to himself. The reason was simple. The backstage corridor ran directly beneath the hall's acoustic shell. When the orchestra played, the sound came down through the structure itself. You could feel it in your hands on the mop handle. You could feel it in your sternum if you pressed your back against the wall and stood still. He did this sometimes, in the half hour after midnight, when the rehearsal ended and the musicians packed up and left. He would stand against the wall in the empty corridor, in the sudden quiet, and hear the silence the way you hear the shape of a sound after it's gone. Tonight, he was standing against the wall when the door above opened and voices tumbled down the stairwell. Complete disaster. Obviously. His hand, though. Did you see how he was holding it? A third voice, lower, sharper. We cannot have this conversation in the building. Not here. Silence. The door shut. Daniel didn't move for a moment. Then he picked up his cart, pushed it to the end of the corridor, and began working his way back. His name backstage was effectively nothing. In 14 months of overnight shifts, he had learned the names of most of the musicians through the call sheets posted in the corridor and the conversations that drifted through walls and open doors. He knew that the principal cellist was a woman named Diane Forsyth, 53, who kept a photo of her dog on her case. He knew that the first chair oboist, Raymond Castillo, was going through a divorce and that he played 7% sharper when he was upset. He had never spoken to either of them. The one who had spoken to him, the one who had made herself very clear on the matter of where he was and was not welcome, was Cecilia Marsh. Cecilia Marsh was the principal violinist. She was 34, with a posture that suggested she had never once slouched against anything in her life, and a stillness about her that other musicians seemed to interpret as authority. She was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Her playing was the kind that made critics reach for language they would never use in any other context. She had encountered Daniel 6 weeks into his employment at the Hall, when he had stopped at the edge of the backstage wing to listen to a run-through of a Ravel piece he hadn't heard in years. He hadn't been blocking anything. He wasn't in anyone's way. He was simply standing, holding his mop, listening. She had walked past, stopped, turned, and looked at him the way you look at a scratch on an otherwise perfect surface. "This area is restricted to musicians and production staff," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm with building maintenance." "Then you understand what restricted means." He had moved without another word. He had not gone back to that part of the wing. He filed it away in the same place he filed a lot of things, the slightly too long pauses when he handed in timesheets, the way certain staff members angled their bodies away from him in the break room, the particular silence that happened when he entered a conversation that was already happening. He was practiced at filing these things. He had been doing it since long before Hartwell Hall. What he could not file away, what stayed loose and uncomfortable somewhere in his chest, was the music itself. He had been hearing it for 14 months. He knew this orchestra the way you know a piece of furniture you live, with its rhythms and quirks, its weak passages, the particular drag in the lower strings during transitions. He heard them the way he used to hear recordings when he was young. Before everything. When he used to sit on the floor of his teacher's studio with his eyes closed and try to feel every instrument separately, then let them recombine. He had been very good. Once. Not good in the way that gets you regional competitions and newspaper mentions, though he had those too. Good in the way that makes your teacher call your parents with a particular tone in his voice. Good in the way that makes other musicians quiet when you start to play. He did not think about this very often. He had found that not thinking about it was, in general, the most practical approach. The conversation he had overheard in the stairwell stayed with him through the rest of his shift and into the gray morning commute home. Something about a hand. Something about disaster. He turned it over while he rode the bus, his guitar case leaning between his knees, his left sock still cold and dark with snowmelt. His daughter's name was Lily, and she was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, a particular shade of green that Daniel sometimes caught himself staring at for just a half-second too long, recalibrating, reminding himself that they were Lily's eyes now, that they belonged to a person who had never met her mother, who knew her only as a kind of atmospheric presence in the apartment, an absence that had a shape. When Daniel got home at 6:40 in the morning, Lily was already awake. She was sitting at the kitchen table in her pajamas, which were printed with tiny foxes, eating cereal with the careful concentration of someone diffusing something. A half-finished drawing lay beside her bowl. She had been drawing horses lately. She went through phases, always with that same total commitment. Horses this month, dinosaurs before that, and before that, a brief but intense period focused exclusively on illustrations of their apartment building from various angles. "You're up early," he said. She shrugged one shoulder. which was her default response to approximately 40% of all incoming statements. He took off his coat, hung it on the hook by the door, set the guitar case against the wall. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, the water running warm over his cold fingers, and then sat down across from her with the last of the coffee from the pot she had somehow figured out how to operate 6 months ago without telling him. "How was it?" she asked. "Cold," he said. "They had rehearsal until late. Did you hear them?" He looked at her. She was looking at her cereal, not at him, but her attention was entirely his way. "Yeah," he said. "A little. Was it good?" He thought about the second movement through the wall, the vibration in his palms, the way Raymond Castillo had bent into a passage in the oboe line and gotten something there, something small and exactly right, that Daniel would have bet money he couldn't get. "It was good," he said. Lily nodded, as though this confirmed something. She pulled her drawing toward herself and added a line to the horse's mane. "Mrs. Aldridge says I have to do a report on a famous musician," she said. "For the spring showcase thing. Anyone you want?" "Anyone." She looked up. "Can you help me?" "Sure." She watched him for a moment, that particular watching she did, the kind that made him feel she was reading something behind his face. "Daddy," she said. "Do you miss playing?" He drank his coffee. He set the cup down carefully. He looked at his daughter, in her fox pajamas, at 6:40 in the morning, with her horse drawing and her green eyes, and he said, "Sometimes." She nodded again. Then she went back to her horse. That morning, technically, it was just past midnight. He sat on the edge of his bed in the 15 minutes before he had to leave for the bus, and he took the guitar from its case and held it in his lap without playing a single note. Just the weight of it, the particular warmth of old spruce, the way his left hand fell naturally across the neck, fingers finding positions from memory, from before. He sat there for 9 minutes. Then he put it away and went to work. The hall had a name for the upcoming performance that was printed on every piece of signage, every ticket, every placard in the lobby. A night at the summit. It was the largest event Hartwell Hall had staged in 3 years, a benefit concert with a sold-out house at $600 a seat, with a guest list that included a sitting senator, 2 Fortune 500 board members, and a documentary film crew that had been granted access to document the orchestra's artistic director, a man named Gordon Hale, whom 3 different music publications had called the most important figure in American classical music in the last decade. The concert was built, in large part, around a single piece, a guitar concerto composed specifically for the hall, to be performed by the orchestra's featured soloist, a man named Preston Whitfield. Preston Whitfield was 41 years old and had been called, at various points, a virtuoso, a genius, and a once-in-a-generation talent. He had recorded 7 albums. He had performed at 2 presidential inaugurations. His hands were insured for $2 million each. His right hand had been injured 4 days before the concert. Daniel learned this not through eavesdropping exactly, not deliberately, but because the walls of the service corridor were genuinely thin, and because on the Tuesday before the Saturday performance, 2 members of the production staff had what they believed to be a private argument in the stairwell directly above his mop bucket. Can't go public. Ticket refunds alone would. I'm not talking about going public. I'm talking about telling Gordon so he can. Gordon knows. Gordon has known since Monday morning. He's handling it. How is he handling it? Preston hasn't been able to grip a pick since the fall. The tendons in his "keep your voice down." A pause. Then, quieter. There's no one. The piece requires a specific technique. It's not interchangeable. You can't just bring in a session player 2 days out and expect, "I know that. So, what are we doing?" A very long silence. "We're hoping," said the first voice, flatly, "that Preston wakes up tomorrow and can hold a pick." Daniel thought about this for a long time. He thought about it while he mopped the lower lobby. He thought about it while he went through the backstage corridor and collected the small pile of printouts someone had left beside the door, set lists, schedule notes, the kind of papers that accumulate in a working theater like sediment. He glanced at them before dropping them in the recycling bin. The guitar concerto's title, Preston Whitfield's name, the tempo markings in the second movement. He stood very still for a moment. He knew this piece. He knew it the way you know something that went into you before you had the defenses to stop it, before you learned to protect yourself from things that mattered. He had listened to the preliminary recordings leaked online, passed around among people who followed this kind of music more times than he could count. In the quiet, after Lily went to sleep, with his headphones on and his eyes closed on the couch, he knew it because it was the kind of piece that made you feel, while you were hearing it, that there was something at the center of experience that music could reach and nothing else could. He knew it because when he had listened to the preliminary recordings, his hands had moved involuntarily, finding the fingering on an invisible neck. He put the papers in the recycling bin. He picked up his mop. He did not say anything to anyone. He told himself he wasn't going to say anything. He told himself this on Wednesday morning, on Thursday morning, and again on the bus to work on Friday night. He reminded himself of the precise geometry of his position, what he was not, where the line was, and what it would cost to approach it. He had a daughter. He had a rent payment due in 11 days. He had a shift that paid $17 an hour and could not afford to be lost over something as impractical as a feeling. He said nothing on Friday night. He said nothing through most of Saturday afternoon, when he came in early because Murray had asked for overtime coverage and because the truth, which he didn't fully examine, was that he wanted to be in the building. He wanted to be close to the thing that was going to happen. At 3 in the afternoon, he was restocking supply carts in the backstage corridor when he heard Gordon Hale's voice through the open door of the rehearsal room. Tight, low, the voice of a man containing something very large, 3 hours from curtain. "I need a name." "Any name." Daniel stood at the cart. He looked at his hands. He thought about the piece. He thought about the second movement, which opened on the guitar alone, 16 bars, a passage that required a technique called rasgueado florio, that almost no one outside of classical Spanish tradition could produce cleanly. He could produce it cleanly. He walked to the rehearsal room door. He knocked twice. Gordon Hale opened it. He was 60 years old, with the kind of white hair that looked deliberately distinguished, and an expression on his face that suggested he had not smiled in approximately 4 days. "I'm with building maintenance," Daniel said. "I work the overnight shift. I know this is not, I heard that there's a problem with the soloist for tonight. The guitar part. And I thought." "You thought what?" Daniel looked at him steadily. "I thought I might be able to help." Gordon Hale looked at him for a long, even moment. At his jacket, which was clean but clearly not expensive. At his hands, which were calloused from work. At the guitar case over his shoulder, which was old and worn and, frankly, embarrassing in the context of this building. That's Gordon started to say something, then stopped. Behind him, Cecilia Marsh appeared in the doorway. She looked at Daniel. Something moved across her face that was not quite recognition she knew who he was, in the way you know the function of a piece of furniture, and then something that was closer to offense. "Is this a joke?" she said. "No," Daniel said. "You clean the floors here, and you," she paused, as if choosing her words from a place of genuine incredulity. "You play classical guitar." "I did. I do." He kept his voice level. "I know the Whitfield Concerto. I've been following it since the preliminary recordings. I know the second movement opens with the rasguado florio sequence, and that the third movement requires a barre position shift that most guitarists can't execute at the tempo Gordon scores it. I can play it." Cecilia Marsh stared at him. "Get him out of here," she said, not to Daniel, but to the room behind her. Then she turned and walked back inside. Gordon Hale looked at Daniel for one more moment. Something moved in his face that might, in a different circumstance, have been curiosity, But he had 3 hours until curtain, and a building full of nervous patrons, and a documentary camera that was going to be rolling in 40 minutes. "I'm sorry," he said. "This isn't something I can." "I understand," Daniel said. He picked up his supply cart. He walked to the end of the corridor. He pushed the cart through the service door and out into the loading area at the back of the building, where the afternoon had gone dark and the snow had started again, fine and dry and steady, the kind that accumulates without you noticing until suddenly there are 3 inches of it. He stood there in the loading area, in the cold, with his cart and his guitar case, and he looked at the door he had just come through. He had known, before he knocked, what the answer would probably be. He had knocked anyway. He wasn't sure, now, whether that made it better or worse. He stayed. He didn't leave. He told himself it was because the shift wasn't over, because he was on the clock until 10, because Murray needed him for post-event cleanup. These things were all technically true. He pushed his cart through the corridors as the hall filled up around him, the staff in black, the patrons in evening wear. The lights coming up warm and gold, the entire architecture of the place performing itself the way it did on these nights, becoming something out of an ordinary building. He kept his eyes down. He cleaned what needed cleaning. He stayed out of the main lobby. At 6:50, 15 minutes before curtain, he was in the lower backstage corridor when he heard it, a sound that was nothing like music, and everything like its absence, a sound that came from above, from the stage-level voices overlapping. Then a sharp male exclamation. Then silence of the particular kind that forms after something has gone wrong. He stopped pushing the cart. What happened, exactly, is this. Preston Whitfield had, in fact, come to the hall. He had strapped his wrist, taken 3 anti-inflammatories, and told his handler that he was fine, that he would manage, that the tendons were not as bad as the orthopedist had said, and that 4 days of rest had helped. His handler had passed this information up the chain. Gordon Hale had accepted it with the desperation of a man who had no better option. At 6:45, Preston Whitfield sat down in the dressing room, lifted his guitar, placed his right hand in position, and could not close his fingers around the body. The tendons, which had been injured when he slipped on ice outside his hotel 4 days ago, had not recovered. He could move his fingers individually. He could not maintain the grip position required to play. He sat in the dressing room for 3 minutes without saying anything. Then he told his handler. The handler told the stage manager. The stage manager told Gordon Hale. Daniel heard none of this directly. He heard the quality of the silence, which was a specific and unmistakable kind. The silence of a machine that has stopped working, that is waiting for someone to come and tell it what to do next. He heard Gordon Hale's voice controlled, thin, saying, "Get everyone off the stage. Now." 5 minutes. He heard the stage door open. He heard running. He was standing at the foot of the backstage stairs when Gordon Hale came down them. Gordon Hale stopped. He looked at Daniel. There was nothing in his expression now, no distinction, no category, no aesthetic judgment. There was only a man 3 minutes from a catastrophe, looking at the one available option. "You said you know the piece," Gordon said. "The second movement, the Rasguado Florio, 12-bar sequence into the ascending tremolo, then the modulation in bar 21. "Yes." Gordon stared at him. A muscle in his jaw moved. "The third movement has a cadenza that Preston composed specifically." "I know the cadenza." Daniel kept his voice quiet. "I know all of it." A long pause. The longest pause of Daniel's adult life. "We have 2 minutes," Gordon said, "and I want you to understand if you go out there and you are not what you say you are, it will be the worst thing that has happened in this building in 30 years. "I know," Daniel said. "I need your yes or your no." Daniel looked up at the stairwell. He looked at Gordon Hale. He thought about Lily at the kitchen table in her fox pajamas, asking if he missed playing. He thought about the wall of the service corridor and the vibration in his hands, and the 14 months of standing very still in the dark with the music coming through the plaster. "Yes," he said. There was no time for anything practical. Gordon led him up the stairs and through the stage door, and the crew stepped aside, not because they understood what was happening, but because Gordon's forward movement had the quality of a force that objects simply cleared a path for. Someone tried to speak, Gordon said very quietly. Not now, and kept walking. In the wings, a crew member took Daniel's jacket without being asked and handed him a dark shirt that was 2 sizes too large. Daniel put it on. He took off his work boots and a stagehand, a young woman who was watching him with wide, blank eyes, the eyes of someone watching a thing happen that they will describe later in as much detail as they can recall. Found a pair of black shoes from the costume room that were close enough. Close enough was what they had. Daniel stood in the wings with his guitar, his old guitar, in its battered canvas case, which he had opened now, the instrument lying across his forearms like something reclaimed. Cecilia Marsh was standing 10 feet away. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said nothing. But he watched her look at his guitar, at the worn tuning pegs, at the body that had a faint crack along the lower bout that he had filled years ago with hide glue, at the strings that he had replaced last week in a specific gauge that he preferred for this kind of music. And he watched her expression do something complicated that she was clearly working to prevent. He turned away from her. He tuned quietly, by ear, in the noise and movement of the wings. The crowd beyond the curtain was a presence 600 people, their collective weight and breath, their settling into seats, their murmur. He tuned to the A from the oboist's warm-up note, which was drifting from on stage. He made 3 small adjustments. Then he stood still. He thought about nothing. He had learned a long time ago how to do this, how to find the place behind thought where the music lived, where it didn't require justification or context, where it was simply itself. Gordon appeared at his elbow. 30 seconds, Gordon said. Okay, Daniel said. Daniel. Gordon paused. It was the first time he had used his name. Whatever happens out there, I need you to lead them, not follow. Lead. Daniel looked at him. I know, he said. He walked onto the stage. The lights were very bright. The orchestra was already seated 44 musicians, in concert black, turning to see him with expressions that ranged from confusion to what he could only describe as a kind of contained alarm. He could feel the moment the audience registered that the person walking out was not Preston Whitfield. A soft wave of murmur, a shift in the acoustic character of the room. He sat down on the soloist's chair. He settled the guitar. He set his left hand on the neck and felt the positions, all of them, exactly where they had always been. He looked at Gordon, who had taken his place on the podium. Gordon raised his baton. The hall went quiet. The first 16 bars of the concerto were the guitar alone. Daniel took a breath. He set his right hand in position. He thought about nothing except the first note. He played. The sound that came out of that guitar in that hall, through that silence, was not what anyone in the room expected. It was not a careful sound. It was not tentative or apologetic. It was a sound with weight to it, with body, with a quality of certainty that seemed to fill the room from a specific point and radiate outward the way heat radiates. The first note simply existed, completely, without qualification, and then the second note existed, and the phrase began to take shape, and the shape was exactly right, not correct in the academic sense, though it was that too, but right in the way that certain moments are right, in the way that something fits exactly into the space it was meant to occupy. He played the 12-bar opening. Somewhere in bar 7, the murmuring in the house stopped. He played through the ascending tremolo passage, his right hand moving with a speed and precision that looked almost casual, almost unhurried. The notes coming in perfect, even sequence, each one distinct, the line carrying forward with the feeling of something inevitable. His left hand shifted at bar 21, exactly at the modulation, the transition so smooth it seemed to simply arrive rather than be executed. He was not thinking about the audience. He was not thinking about Gordon Hale or Cecilia Marsh or the $2 million worth of insured hands that were currently in a hotel room somewhere not far from here. He was thinking about Lily at the kitchen table, about the small sound she made when she was falling asleep in the car, about the way music had felt when he was 22 and the world had seemed entirely made of possibility. He was thinking about the 14 months of standing against a wall in a corridor, feeling the music come through the plaster, knowing exactly what was on the other side. In the wings, Gordon raised the baton for the orchestra's entrance. They came in, and something happened that Daniel had not fully planned for, or perhaps had planned for in some way he hadn't let himself acknowledge. The orchestra, those 44 musicians who had, collectively, spent their entire professional lives surrounded by excellence, who were rarely surprised by anything, came in with a quality of attention that was different from normal. Something in his playing had opened a door, and they walked through it. They were following him. Not in the mechanical sense, every player follows the soloist in a concerto, structurally, but in a different sense. They were listening to him the way musicians listen when something is happening that they did not expect. They were playing toward him. They were matching something in the character of his sound. The hall was still. 600 people, not a sound. Cecilia Marsh stood in the wings and watched his hands. She had been playing professionally since she was 9 years old. She had performed with the greatest orchestras on 3 continents. She had been in rooms with musicians who were transcendent, genuinely, not metaphorically transcendent, and she knew what it looked like. The specific quality of physical ease that extraordinary playing had, the way the body stopped appearing to try. She watched his hands on the guitar, and she stopped thinking about whether it was appropriate that he was out there. She stopped thinking about who he was and what he had been doing in the building. She simply watched. In the second movement, there was a passage, a long, slow dialogue between the guitar and the violin section, a passage that Preston Whitfield had always played beautifully, and Daniel played it in a way that she had not heard before, not differently, not in contradiction to the score, but with a quality of interiority that she couldn't immediately categorize. It was a passage about loss, or about the memory of something, and he played it as though it was not abstract to him. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked back up. The third movement arrived. The cadenza, the passage that Preston Whitfield had composed specifically for his own hands, that had been described in a review as the single most technically demanding guitar passage written in the last 20 years, began. The orchestra went silent. The hall went silent. Gordon lowered his baton. Daniel was alone. For 4 minutes and 32 seconds, which is how long the cadenza takes, Daniel Mercer played without support from anyone in the world. He played everything he had. He played the years in the corridor and the cold sock and the duct-taped guitar case. He played Lily in her fox pajamas, asking him if he missed it. He played the thing he had put away, the thing he had carried without opening for 4 years, the thing that had no useful place in a life organized around survival. He played it all into the piece. The last note of the cadenza rang out and then faded, slowly, into the hall. Silence. 4 full seconds of absolute silence. And then the hall came apart. The standing ovation began before the orchestra had even lowered their instruments. It began in the first 2 rows, people simply rising, as if something had pulled them upward and moved back through the house, like water moving downhill. By the time it reached the back of the hall, it was complete. All 600 people. The sound of them enormous and continuous. On stage, the orchestra was on their feet. Daniel was still in the chair, guitar across his lap, looking out at the house with an expression that was not triumph, exactly something quieter, something that had more space in it. He looked down at his hands. He turned them over, the way you look at something you had almost forgotten you owned. The post-performance hour had a quality that Daniel had not anticipated. He had expected to step off stage and disappear to find his cart, to change back into his work clothes, to let the event recede into the background, the way he had receded into backgrounds his entire time in this building. He had prepared himself for this. It seemed the appropriate outcome, the graceful one. What happened instead? Gordon Hale was waiting in the wings. He said nothing, just gripped Daniel's hand with both of his, very hard, for a moment. Then he stepped back and looked at him the way you look at something that has just rearranged your understanding of a situation. The documentary camera had been rolling through the entire performance. Daniel found this out 30 seconds after coming off stage, when a young man with a camera on his shoulder materialized at a polite distance, and a woman beside him said, very carefully, "We were filming from the balcony. The whole thing. I hope would you be willing to?" "No," Daniel said. "Not tonight." She nodded. She stepped back. The musicians filtered through the wings in their post-performance movement, and something changed in the quality of that movement when they passed him. The principal cellist, Diane Forsyth, stopped and said, "That was the most extraordinary thing I've heard in this hall." She said it simply, without performance, like a statement of fact. Then she walked on. The second violinist, whose name Daniel knew, Marcus Webb, 26, 4 magazine profiles, stopped and looked at him and said nothing, and then said, "I'm sorry. For whatever, I'm sorry," and kept walking. And Cecilia Marsh. She came last. The stage was mostly clear. The lights had shifted to work light, the romantic gold replaced by the cool functional white of the after hours. She walked toward him, and he watched her come and did not look away. And she did not look away either. She stopped 3 feet from him. "You play at that level," she said. Not a question. A pause. "You have been working in this building for how long?" 14 months. Something moved across her face, a series of things, actually, one after another, and he could see her letting them happen rather than suppressing them, which was not what he had expected from her. "I treated you," she started. "You were operating on information," he said. "What you could see. That's not an excuse." "I know." He paused. "But it's a reason." She looked at him. Then she extended her hand. And he shook it, and neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said right now. Gordon Hale found him an hour later, when Daniel had changed back into his work clothes and was standing in the lower lobby with his guitar case, waiting for the building to empty enough that he could do his rounds. "I want to make you an offer," Gordon said. "Tonight's not. Tonight changed what I know is possible in this building." Gordon's voice was not the one he had used in the crisis. It was quieter, more considered. "I have a guest soloist slot that opened for the spring series. 3 performances, contracted, paid at professional rates. And I want to talk about something more permanent after that." Daniel looked at him. "I have a daughter," Daniel said. "I need something that's stable. Then let's talk about stability." Gordon held his gaze. "But I need you to understand what happened tonight. That's a one-time emergency. What I'm describing is different. I'm describing a professional relationship. Your level of musicianship deserves a professional context. That's what I'm offering." A long quiet. "Let me think about it," Daniel said. "Of course." Gordon nodded once. Then, almost as an afterthought, "What happened? Why are you—" He gestured, meaning, "The cart, the corridor, the 14 months. My daughter," Daniel said simply. "She needed stable, and what I was doing wasn't stable. So I found stable." Gordon looked at him. "I reorganized," Daniel said. "There's a difference." He took the bus home at 11:30. The city was quiet in the way it gets after midnight on a Saturday, not fully asleep, but resting. The hard, bright energy of the evening hour softened down to something more forgiving. The snow had continued through the performance and the aftermath and was still coming now, steady and fine, an inch on the parked cars and the sidewalks, the city wearing a layer of white that covered the gray underneath and made everything look, temporarily, like it had been newly made. He sat on the bus with his guitar case between his knees. His hands were in his lap. He looked at them in the passing light from the street, the calluses on the fingertips of his left hand, the slight asymmetry of his right hand from years of playing, The particular roughness along his palms from the mop handle and the shovel and the supply cart. Both at once. He had always been both at once. He arrived at his building at 12:15. He climbed the stairs quietly, not wanting to wake Lily, though he knew, with the particular parental knowledge that has no real explanation, that she was awake, that she had set some internal alarm to wait for him. He was right. She was sitting up in bed when he opened her door, blinking in the light from the hallway, her hair in the specific disorder that meant she had been lying there awake for a while. "You're back," she said. "I am." He sat on the edge of her bed. "You were supposed to be asleep." She gave him the one-shoulder shrug. What happened? He thought about how to answer. He thought about Gordon Hale and Cecilia Marsh and 44 musicians who had turned toward him in the bright lights and followed. And he thought about the cadenza and the silence before the applause, and the 4 seconds that had felt like the whole room holding its breath. "Something happened at work tonight," he said. "Something kind of big." Lily looked at him carefully. "Did you play?" "Yeah," he said. "I played." Her face did something not surprise. Exactly. More like arrival. Like something she had been waiting for had finally shown up. "Was it good?" she asked. He thought about it. He thought about it honestly. "Yeah," he said. "It was good." She reached over and took his hand, the left one, the one with the calluses on the fingertips, and held it in both of hers, turning it over the way he had turned his own hands over on stage, examining it, and then she held it against her chest and lay back down. "I knew you would be," she said. He sat with her until she was asleep. 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in late March, when the snow had finally gone for good and the city was doing its tentative spring thing, windows cracked open, coats unbuttoned, the particular quality of afternoon light that makes the whole world look like it might be worth something. After all, Daniel Mercer walked through the front doors of Hartwell Hall with Lily beside him. Not through the service entrance, not at midnight. Through the front doors, past the marble columns, past the brass door handles that no longer gleamed because it was daytime, and the hall wasn't performing tonight, just rehearsing, just being its everyday working self. Lily was wearing her good coat, the green one, and had her hair in the 2 braids she wore when she felt that something important was happening. She held his hand and looked up at the ceiling of the lobby, which was 40 feet high and painted with something she would examine in more detail next time. "This is where you work?" she said. "This is where I work," he said. She looked around at all of it, the lobby, the photographs of past performers, the polished floors, the distant sound of the orchestra warming up behind the auditorium doors, individual instruments finding their pitches and settling toward something collective. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah. Can I hear them sometime?" He looked down at her. "That's kind of why we're here," he said. The hall was half lit for afternoon rehearsal, the stage illuminated, the house in working light, the rows of seats mostly empty. Gordon had said bring her. Gordon had said come early and sit in the 5th row where the sound was best, where you could feel the whole acoustic shape of the hall around you, where the orchestra was close enough to see the individual musicians' faces. They sat in the 5th row. Lily sat very straight, in the way she sat when she was paying real attention, and watched the musicians take their seats with an expression that Daniel recognized as her absorbing things, storing them, filing them in the place where she kept information that she would produce later. In some context, he couldn't anticipate. Gordon came out. He raised his baton. The orchestra began. Lily was still beside him, very still. In the specific way she became still when something was happening that she didn't want to miss. He could feel her attention as a physical quality beside him, the focused quiet of it. He watched her face. He watched her hear it. And he understood, in the way you understand things that have been true for a long time before you name them, that this was what it had always been about. Not the performance, not the standing ovation, not the professional contract or the spring series, or the particular satisfaction of doing something at the level you were capable of after a long time of not. All of that was real. All of that mattered. But this, watching his daughter hear live orchestral music for the first time. Watching her face go open and still with the impact of it, this was what all the other things were in service of. He had carried a guitar for 14 months without playing it in public. He had stood against a wall in a cold corridor and felt the music come through the plaster and not let himself fully feel what that meant. He had shoveled snow from the steps of a building where he was invisible, where he moved around the edges of things that were not meant for him, and he had done it without bitterness, mostly with a kind of patient, tired practicality because there was a small girl at home with fox pajamas and green